Has science made philosophy obsolete? We'll find out in a few minutes. I'd like to welcome to the stream a new friend of mine that who I made a few days ago, chatting with online, and I've looked at some of his work, and I think we might reach a conclusion today. G'day, Michael. How are you?
I'm fantastic. How are you?
Very good, very good. Well, it's Melbourne, Australia here, and it's a 40 degrees Celsius day. So I've got a few fans going on, and I've got a bit of an AC in the background. But it's one of those warm days that make the brain melt.
I feel from you. I'm originally from Savannah, Georgia. It's about 70 degrees. We're American, so we're
Yeah,
used to
Fahrenheit.
Fahrenheit. But I'm up in Wisconsin. It's about 20 degrees right now. So
Oh wow, okay,
yeah.
oh, that's chilled. Yeah. Um, right. I mean, this topic, we've been chatting about what kind of topic we want to get into. We understand, we understand that you have a background philosophy. Before we start getting deep into the conversation, I'd like you to tell me and your and the audience right now your background and what made you interested in philosophy.
Yeah, so I've always been interested in philosophical questions. Not to get too personal, but this largely resulted from the death of some loved ones that I experienced as a young child. So I've always been interested in questions of um, what happens after we die, what we're supposed to be doing while we're here, what my purpose is, what my meaning is. As a child and as a young teenager, that a lot of those questions were kind of answered by religion. I was introduced to philosophy in high school. And when I went to college, I decided that was going to be my major. So I have a BA in philosophy. It's a general history of philosophy degree. From there, I went on and got a few history degrees. So I have a master's in historical theology, kind of where I focused on the relationship between science and religion, specifically in the early modern period. After that, I got a master's in history where I focused on, and this sounds horribly boring, so I'm sorry to start it off like this, but for my master's in history, I focused on the reception of Darwinism in 19th century America, specifically in the American South. So
That is not boring at all. Oh God, that's brilliant. I love that.
and so my graduate degrees are in history, specifically the history of science, and I'm currently working on my PhD in philosophy. And the history of the science and the philosophy of science are kind of two very closely related fields. So that's kind of how I got to where I'm at today.
Right, right. And I think that's really, I mean, this is the topic of today, because you get this ultimate conflict, and it sort of started to happen now. You get some scientists who claim philosophy to be dead, and then these are extreme scientists. And on the other hand, you get some extreme philosophers saying, hey, the proper thinking philosophies has been always the mother of all sciences. And we know that it's partially true, because natural philosophers, that's what scientists used to be called. But let's track back. I mean, let's go into a journey before all of that, before 2500 BC and the pre-Socratic, and even before that. Philosophy, the love for wisdom and knowledge, that's what the words mean. Do you think it started from the moment the human brain has got bigger and started to engage in situations other than pure survival?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. So I'm going to use a couple of words here, and I'll try to be as clear as possible. Um, I'm inclined to agree with that statement, so long as we have a very loose understanding of philosophy.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, very loosely speaking. So, I love ancient history. And human beings, of course, originated in Africa about 300,000 years ago. Starting about 200,000 years ago, 150,000 years ago, we start to get evidence of artwork that was being created by these early humans that a lot of scholars believe were representative of, they served no practical purpose. They were there most likely for symbolic or religious reasons, right? Now, to be 100% clear, we don't know why they made these things. So Venus of Willendorf comes to mind, the statue of the woman that we believe was a fertility symbol. There's some numerous examples of cave paintings that are early representations of art. Now, I bring that up to get back to that original question, because I think that this is representative of abstract thought that is not directly related to survival, and abstract thought concerning things like death.
Yes. Yeah. And the reason I bring this forth, because I think we're going to have to talk about the nature of knowledge and the a priori, a posteriori situation. Because if our knowledge and consciousness, and therefore philosophy and reflection, has only evolved in the recent history, we're talking 300,000 years, which is the oldest Homo sapien found in Morocco. Mm-hmm. That tells me that our consciousness and our ability to reason and to logic has evolved and increased over time. And mm-hmm. therefore, the claim for a priori knowledge is somewhat under scrutiny now, because if this was the case, why didn't we see more advanced knowledge earlier on, and didn't wait for the brain to go from 300 centimeter all the way to 1500 of the recent Homo sapien skulls?
Yeah, so I think that's a really interesting comment, and I want to. So I kind of wear two hats where I'm at right now, because I teach both history and philosophy. So my historian hat would want to say that, with respect to the claims about humans having a priori knowledge and that we're born with certain innate ideas, historically, I think that ignores the role that culture plays in contributing to the development of human civilization. And the reason why I say that is because most of human history was basically the same. Like, if you were born 300,000 years ago or 200,000 years ago or 100,000 years ago, that's a lot of time. But your life on this earth, no matter where you were at, who you were, would have been roughly the same. Humans were hunters and gatherers. You would have been walking around collecting foodstuffs as you go. That all changes with the agricultural revolution, the Neolithic revolution. And that changes with the systemization of religion, government, systems of writing. So you see a rapid progress. I'll use that word progress very loosely. Progress of the development of human knowledge that doesn't happen until civilization happens. So if you're going to argue for like this sort of a priori knowledge that you were hinting at, I don't know how you would explain that.
Right. Yeah. No, I'm a posteriori sort of person, so I deny a priori. I'm with David Hume on this one. I don't think it's possible, and I don't think it's helpful. We talked about maybe some innate dispositions for you to be able to do something better than something else, but that can be easily transferred in the gene and genetic code. It does not need to have a theory of the forms of Plato that sits outside of humans' knowledge and suggests that there's another reality outside of our normal external reality that we're not quite sure of, because nobody could debunk solipsisms to date.
Yeah. And getting to this loose use of the word philosophy, I mean, I think you start to see, I'm glad we kind of started here, because it might be helpful start at the very beginning. But you see early examples of myths and religions start to develop. I'm using the word myth here academically to refer to stories that like origin stories and stories that explain aspects of reality. I'm not using it in a derogatory way. So different from common uses of the term. But early myths that we find in these primal cultures, I think, speak to this more like philosophical understanding. We see burial of the dead start like 50,000 years ago. There's even evidence that Neanderthals were burying their dead. So this raises a question about other of our related cousins that had, you know, what we would call consciousness, right? So I think that's where philosophy starts. I mean, you have this classic, like philosophy starts in ancient Greece. I would say that these early myths are an attempt to capture a sort of wonder and questioning about how the world is structured and our place in it.
Yeah, and Michael, and to put it precise, we're talking about precursors here. We're not talking about the proper. So these are I mean, we ancient Greeks have actually enslaved other neighboring nations, so they can work in big positions that we won't call slavery today, so they can be free to think about politics and philosophy. This is how important it was to them. But when we talk about precursors, we're talking about still survival is very important. But somehow we've got enough time, enough spare time now. We've got the fire going, we've got the cooking going, we've got the storytelling, and now suddenly we've got that leisure now to say, well, what are these lights up in the sky?
Mm-hmm. And speaking to that point, I mean, you see these stories across the board. Take your pick of any indigenous society you want to, whether we're talking about North America, South America, Europe, Africa, Asia, Australia. You see it everywhere. And in all of these societies, there are origin stories which attempt to explain for that people group who they are, how they got there, and what the universe is like. So I think these philosophical inclinations, this kind of natural curiosity about the world, might be a part of, I'm not going to say it's a priori, but I think it might be just a basic part of our human experience, right? That kind of transcends culture, ethnicity, class, all that good stuff.
Yeah, is a statement here, but I want to. We want to probe it together, because I think by definition that position constitutes a posteriori, because if you're going to name knowledge that starts with experience, it's by definition then a posteriori. So a priori suggests that the knowledge pre-exists your condition, and it depends on what school that a priori knowledge might be attainable or not even attainable. So, I mean, it's quite interesting, though. I like the way we started from the very beginning, because there are a lot of people that would think, oh, philosophy, it must be the Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. But I've always wanted to claim that as soon as we started to question things, because that's going to lead to something else, that each of us right now, obviously using the term loosely still, a philosopher somehow. We have a worldview, we have a philosophy, we have a way of conducting things and reasoning with things. It could be quite flawed, but it is philosophy nonetheless.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Philosophy is one of these subjects. I mean, to be clear, academic philosophy is very dense, right? And not very accessible to somebody that just wants to pick up and read. It doesn't have to be that way, though, because I think people, I mean, at some point, I'm going to make a bold statement here, but at some point in your life, you're going to ask some of these questions, right? What is my purpose here? What am I supposed to be doing while I'm here? What happens after I die? Is there a God? I mean, these are questions that all of us, might be at, 3 a.m. when you're lying in your bed awake. Well, it might be after a traumatic life experience. What is the meaning of life? But these are questions I think everybody on some level can relate to, for sure.
I mean, philosophy as well has evolved. I mean, we've got now the the Frankfurt School, where and there's a call for, hey, come down from your ivory towers and come down to earth. And we have that, and it started 2,500 years ago with the conflict, not a conflict, or a disagreement between the teacher and the student, Plato and Aristotle, in that school of Athens, infamous painting, where the one index is pointing to the sky and the palm is pointing to the floor, and saying, well, knowledge is here. And maybe that's part of Aristotle paving the way to saying, we need to have this discipline of thinking, the way of thinking, in a way that we can make use of to apply to the real world, and maybe eventually make our life easy.
Yeah, that's an interesting dichotomy, because if I'm teaching and I want to speak to that a little bit, because if I'm teaching a intro to philosophy class, or even if I'm teaching like a intellectual history class, right? Philosophy, the start date is typically with the Greeks. If you have an instructor that's a little bit more broadly focused, I like to include Chinese and Indian philosophy in that. Chinese philosophy, Confucius, predates Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, but but Thales is the first to kind of draw that distinction that I think you're talking about, right? So Thales is the first person, Thales 585, famous, he predicts a solar eclipse. But by doing so, he's trying to explain through mathematical reasoning what was once reserved for mystical or religious explanations. So kind of how you said, he's kind of bringing it down to earth. He's making it more explicable. He's making it more explainable, and he's appealing to a common source of reasoning that everyone has access to, not just a select priestly caste or class.
Yeah, because think about it this way: if you explain it that way, you'll be able to start predicting it. The superstitious phenomena, and people were doing lots of rituals and worshiping, and even sacrifice sometimes to avoid this horrible ordeal, because they used to be frightening. And by explaining it away through mathematics, you'd be able to say, well, that's a normal phenomena, and I can actually tell you when the next one is going to be coming around the corner, and it removes the fear that these sort of things used to cast in people's hearts.
Mm-hmm. And this is a shift away from, and I don't know, I think this, I don't want to overemphasize Thales's impact, because historically I'm not just academically saving myself here, but it is a shift away from what I would call mythical explanation to a shift away from myth, which attempts to explain cosmology, to an attempt to explain cosmology with mathematics, again, with a common source of reason, a source of reason that's available to everyone. And it's a shift away from a more mystical understanding of reality, a demystifying, right? I think this is something that Sagan says, right, in the demon haunted world. But
yeah,
so I agree with how you structured that.
So just to put it in perspective as well, these guys used to be also natural philosophers. So along with philosophy, they would contemplate a bit of astronomy, and maybe even a bit of astrology, because the precursors of astronomy is astrology, and you get even alchemy, as a precursor for modern chemistry. So there were. And people, unfortunately, I see people bagging Aristotle, saying, "Oh, this guy was a crackpot with all these things about the 4 or 5 elements." And I tried to explain, these people were the pioneers of the time. For the first time, he was having a go. Remember, we're not talking telescope or microscope. These people are using purely their brains and a bit of observation to try to postulate what is happening. So right. I don't think they should be given that much slack, to be honest.
No, I mean, that's you know, that's a little silly. I would stack up Aristotle's resume against anybody. You're going to be you're going to be hard pressed to find somebody that's that accomplished more in their lifetime. If I had to make a list of the smartest people that ever lived, Aristotle would easily be in the top 3. Right?
Yeah, well, I agree. But the argument would be, oh, he was a sexist.
Yeah.
Well, I know everybody was probably.
Listen, I tell my students this all the time. Anybody, basically, this is a big generalization. Anybody who lived before 1950, they've got some skeletons in their closet historically, right? So, yeah, I think what you said, I want to come back to because, again, looking at this from a historical perspective, we want to avoid in history what's called anachronism, which is reading the present into the past, right? So we have to understand that modern science really didn't get its start until about the 16th century. Mm-hmm. And the people that came before that were employing vastly different methods for knowing and understanding the world that today may not even be considered science. But Aristotle is the father of most of the natural sciences. Mm-hmm. Everything from physics to biology to psychology, geology, you name it, Aristotle had his hands in it for sure.
Yeah. I agree. I mean, we'll start with Socrates. I mean, Socrates, we don't even know if he actually existed. We only know him through the writings of Plato. But even then, because it doesn't hold any dogmatic or religious belief, we can just take the stance of a guy walking around and not giving answers, but just asking questions. Mm-hmm. And would that be? And a lot of people are saying maybe this is philosophy. If something would encompass the spirit of philosophy, if you wish, is the art of asking the right questions to start with. Because if you start with the right questions, it might lead you to the right answers.
Mm-hmm. That's a good point. I would also briefly point out we have Aristophanes' The Clouds, which is about Socrates, but that presents a very different picture of Socrates than Plato presents. But yeah, the historical question aside, I tell my students this a lot. It's asking a good question and asking the right question in a particular situation is probably one of the most difficult skills to develop. And I do think that Socrates exemplifies this sort of philosophical questioning, this ability to, in some cases, and this is what got Socrates in trouble, dismantling power structures through the asking of these questions and challenging these kind of like preconceived notions that we have about people in power, being very subversive, anti-authority through his question asking, which got him killed. So maybe you don't want to follow Socrates' example there. Yeah. But in other areas as well. I mean, this is what Socrates was very much so interested in, this question of, what does it mean to be a good life? What does it mean to live a good life? What's the best way to go about living a good life? How should I best inform my actions? And he expressed this, whether or not it's genuine, doesn't matter, but he expressed this knowledge to really seek after that. And that's what he oriented his life towards. So, yeah, I think that being able to ask a good question in the Socratic style is fundamental to philosophy, for sure.
Yeah. One of my least favorite of the Trinity is Plato, and mainly because of, he's the guy, I think he was responsible of a lot of Christian apologists later on. They've taken heat from him, but take that away from him. But let's purely talk about his epistemology, because he's making very big claims here. The theory of forms, the fact that the mind and reality doesn't exist, and a lot of big claims, and there's a lot of virtue as well in there. There's a lot of morality, but for me, what it stood out for me and kind of a turn off for me is the way he was pushing on that this is an illusion, this reality, and a distorted reflection of a perfect reality that is sort of been cast away from us because we are made to forget them because of the trauma of birth and weird allegations like that. How do you evaluate him?
As much as I might disagree with Plato, Plato would also be in the top 3 of the smartest people that ever lived. So, but you're right. So just to give a little bit of context here about why we're talking about Plato and Aristotle so much. Plato and Aristotle, those two are the foundations of Western philosophy.
Yes.
I mean, historically, you're not going to find more important thinkers that have dramatically influenced the course of Western civilization, yes, but also the major monotheistic traditions of the Western world. Judaism, Christianity, Islam owe a tremendous debt to both Plato and Aristotle at different times and in different places. But so in terms of Western history, the Western philosophical tradition, Plato, Aristotle are the foundation.
Yeah. I mean, I don't want to make Aristotle to be the saint of irreligious people, because he is the one started. He inspired the Kalam cosmological argument by William Lane Craig, and Al-Ghazali picked it up because he started the prime mover. And the poor guy might have been trying to postulate physics, and because that's what you could see. Yeah.
And in the Christian world, Thomas Aquinas's philosophy is largely a reaction to Aristotle. Aquinas basically founded the doctrine of the current Catholic Church. So, yeah, I mean, let's not. Aristotle played his part for sure, right? So, getting back to what you brought up about Plato, I want to focus on that a little bit because this is one of those ideas that has been with philosophy ever since. And you brought up this idea. I think it's best represented in Plato's Republic. If you look up the allegory of the cave, there's a lot of information on there. It's a short snippet from Plato's Republic, which, by the way, in terms of writing, Plato's definitely the more readable philosopher.
Yes, I agree. Yeah.
And I actually recommend for people that are just getting started in philosophy, by all means, read Plato. Like, it's actually enjoyable to read. So in Plato's Republic, he has this idea that you referenced of the allegory of the cave, which is the idea that you have these people, they've since birth, there's a lot of different ways to frame this, but basically you have these people who since birth have been chained up and they're facing a cave wall. And the only thing that they've ever been able to see their whole life are these shadows that are moving along the cave wall. And one day, one of them gets free. He turns around from the cave wall, faces behind him, and he realizes that these shadows are being cast by a fire that's placed up above, and that there's these people walking around basically casting these shadow images, right? And he makes his way past those people. He climbs out of the cave. He comes into the daylight. He's blinded by the sun, right? All of this to suggest, Hanney, what you were saying, that reality as we see it / experience it is a shadowy representation of what is quote unquote real. And that what is real lies beyond this reality or is greater than this reality, right? And that idea was picked up by a lot of Christian, Jewish, Muslim philosophers as in the bedrock, a lot of those early apologists. And you still see remnants of it today. Maybe to get...
It's made its way to quantum mechanics. Because of the duality of is it a particle or a wave, sort of thing.
Well, and I'm glad you brought that up. Yeah, it has. It's also made its way to, and not to throw anybody in particular under the bus, but because these scientists have had way more distinguished careers than I ever will. But if you look at people like Roger Penrose, for
Oh
example,
yeah, the
um,
consciousness.
consciousness, and he also, there was an interview I saw with him where he's having a conversation with William Lane Craig, where he gets right up to it, but I think, and I don't want to put words in his mouth, but he basically believes in a Platonic understanding of mathematics.
Yeah, yeah. So that conversation was the one on Unbelievable, right?
I believe so.
Yeah, it was unbelievable. I've watched it. He still like when William Lane Craig tried to push him to sort of invoke an entity or a god, he still says no. It's all
Right.
naturalistic,
Hmm.
but somehow suggesting that he's actually suggesting that consciousness is a fundamental physical reality, or one of the because that's what we try to do in physics. What is the fundamental? What is the what Democritus talked about as the atom, which is the indivisible? Is it really then at a quantum level? What if there is even something smaller?
Mm-hmm.
And that smaller thing is consciousness, because at the end of the day, everything is meaningless unless it's perceived. I think somebody said, obviously, cogito ergo sum, that's the Descartes, but Berkeley says to exist is to be perceived.
Yep.
And that's very important, because there's no meaning to anything. If there's no consciousness around, if the world is just made of rocks and there's no consciousness, does it exist? It probably does, but it's not perceived by any conscious. Therefore, it's immaterial, or it doesn't matter, sort of thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's been a minute since I've listened to that interview. I just remember him saying stuff that sounded Platonic. It got me a little concerned. I was like, whoa, what's going on here? And then you have other physicists. Again, I'm not trying to make enemies of world-renowned physicists. But,
let me guess, Michio Kaku.
I'm not as familiar with his stuff. I was going to say Max Tegmark, who wrote the book Our Mathematical Universe.
Yes.
Who he's arguing for it's not strict Platonism, and he's not invoking a deity or anything like that, but he does say that mathematics exists outside of the physical universe, that it's beyond the physical universe. So yeah, you still got Platonism today for sure, especially like you brought up, especially with ideas about consciousness.
I mean, math. Let's think about math for a second here, because it's been claimed. I mean, there's always the argument: is it descriptive or prescriptive? Is it invented or discovered? And is it sits outside of our logical sense, in the sense that it is true whether we exist or not, and therefore it's an absolute. If it's an absolute situation like the laws of logic, that you can never deny them under any condition, then therefore they are necessary truth, and therefore they're transcendent to consciousness.
Yes. I don't know if we want to get into that can of worms. I'm more than happy to. But
it's I know. I mean, but I think David Hume, and I think this might be a different conversation on a different day, because I love how David Hume debunked that notion while still keeping, and that's what he does with the impressions and ideas, and areas that you can falsify, like a married bachelor, and how you connect words and meanings together, because if all bachelors in the world die, like humans die, the word bachelor will cease to exist, because animals don't marry, and therefore the word bachelor doesn't mean anything anymore. And so is mathematics, and it's going from the simple to the complex. Two is synonymous to 1 + 1 always, and it's not a result, and therefore you cannot falsify it, and therefore it's an idea standing on its own. But it's a human construct of the mind, and it does not exist outside of the mind.
Yes. So I'm going to jump into it. We'll talk
yes,
about it.
Please do. No, Don't worry about it. Let's dig deep. Don't worry.
So I'm very sympathetic to that position. So I would say that, and this is interesting because this is what a lot of people will point to. I think this view of mathematics is one of the last holdouts of Platonism that I've seen.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Well, how do you explain mathematics? Right. Or, so and we could also talk about the relationship between math and science. But let me just briefly say, well, maybe not briefly, but let me just say, Hume's position is similar to a position in the philosophy of science that we could call like structural realism. So, which is the idea that science employs these mathematical models to explain aspects of reality that are reducible to calculation, right? So we have these models and we say, okay, do these models fit on the phenomenon that we're observing? And if yes, okay, this is a successful model. Newton's laws of motion, Kepler's laws of planetary motion, or Newton's law of gravity, Kepler's laws of planetary motion, eventually Einstein's theory of relativity. All of these ideas are mathematically based, yes, but that's not to say that the mathematics is somehow inherent in something like gravity itself, right? The number isn't inherent to the object. The number is just a description of the object, right? So if I have 3 apples on my table, that apple doesn't somehow contain 3-ness, right? It's just a logical category that I'm applying to what I'm seeing. And I would say that, well, and there's a lot of scientists and philosophers that would disagree with me, but I would say that that's what we're seeing with mathematics.
Oh, I actually agree. I agree. So do you agree then? Whenever there's something abstract, anything abstract, then it's a brain endeavor. It's a mind endeavor. It does not exist outside of the mind. It's the mind trying to make sense of the world, it's trying to navigate the world, and it creates these indexing and patterning models to make sense of the world. However, if you want something existing outside of you, a rock would do the trick because you can then pick it up, hold it, weigh it, show it to other people, put it on display for a lot of other people to see it, examine its makeup, and throw somebody with it and give him a black eye. So you can do all of that. You can't do that with the number 7.
Right. 7-ness is not something that you stumble upon, and you don't bump into a number 7, right? You can bump into 7 birds or 7 deer or whatever, but yeah. So I would agree with that.
And seven talking about having a go at a bit of religion. Then 7, the way it's revered in religion, you see here the number 7, and I'm not sure if you ever heard the same analogy about the perfection of the triangle and the square, and everything can be understood in these 2 terms, in terms of forms. And triangle, it's 3, a square is 4, the 2 together is 7. Perfection.
Yeah, there's also, kind of speaking to that, I mean, there's also been a very close connection throughout history of mathematics to religion. I think this begins with Pythagoras, who had a kind of a religious understanding of what numbers were. It's picked up by Plato. Like, if you're a Platonist, you believe that these numbers that there's Platonic forms of numbers that exist outside of our reality. Socrates, I forget which dialogue it is, but he uses mathematics to prove the forms, where he teaches geometry to the slave boy. I want to say it's in the Meno. I could be wrong about that. It's been a while. But so, and then later on, especially in the more mystical traditions, the more like alchemical traditions, you have this association of like numerology. And this is where you get like the biblical references in the Hebrew Bible and the Christian New Testament, with the use of certain sorts of numbers that are supposed to represent perfection. They're perfect because they're like 7 is not divisible. six is. That's why the mark of the beast, 666, is supposed to be bad, is because it's a number that can be broken down a lot, whereas 7 cannot. So there's been a long history of that association between certain sorts of numbers and certain types of religious beliefs, for sure. Yeah.
But even that notion, we can falsify it in a second here. If geometry is quite transcendent, and these shapes are because again, ontology. One of the things about ontology that I would accept, that the triangle is known for its angles, and the three of them, and without that, it's no longer a triangle. So it's inbuilt, and I can understand that. I want to accept that. It still doesn't need a supernatural entity, but some of it are falsified. So if you understand the world or the universe to be flat, two parallel lines will never meet in Euclidean geometry. But we know now, once you apply curvature, actually two parallel lines can meet. So that has been falsified, because and then experiment and a posteriori knowledge has come to correct something that we perceive to be correct for quite some time, and it tells you that a posteriori knowledge will always trump an a priori knowledge, because you can actually start using it and you can build technology around it, and it is one that is empirical and can be verified.
That's a really good point. And I think that this is one of the things, if we look back at what's called the scientific revolution, right, that starts back, usually people date it to Copernicus. I think Galileo is a better representation of this, but exactly what you said is one of the things that sparks the scientific revolution. Because before, mathematics was treated kind of as its own separate thing. It was never really applied to empirical observation. It's with Copernicus and Copernicus's argument, mathematical argument. If you read Copernicus's On the Revolution of the Heavenly Spheres, it's just a bunch of proofs, right?
Yeah.
It's not observation. But Copernicus makes the argument that in order for these proofs to be true, they have to correspond with what is actually happening, right?
Yeah.
If these models are going to be correct, if we're going to call these models correct, it has to be what's
But Michael, you can see the precursors. So nothing just like, I don't think empiricism just jumped out. So these were like the steps that, you demand a little bit more, and you get to empiricism where it becomes a lot more solidified. But I think these are quite respectful attempts at, hey, I need to give you a bit more meat,
Definitely. I think everything in history has its lineage that we can sort of trace back. I mean, there were empiricists, in a way, you could argue that somebody like Confucius in Chinese history is an empiricist because of his emphasis on this world and what's happening in this world. There's a famous example of one of his students that comes to him and says, Master, how should I perform the rituals for honoring the dead? And Confucius says, you don't know how to honor your fellow person. How can you expect to honor the dead? Like, so kind of a bringing back. And in certain Indian schools, you have in Indian philosophy, there is roughly around the 5th century, you have the emergence BCE, you have the emergence of all these different schools. And there are empiricist schools, just like you have examples of this in Greece as well. People like Aristotle that are more focused on the tangible. Well, Aristotle got a lot of observation, empirical stuff wrong, but again,
and it's not his fault that, I mean, the tools that we use right now were not available then. He was just using pure mind and maybe a little bit of observation, but that was about it. So I can't really. But so far, we're seeing philosophy and reflection are still into play here. These natural philosophers, even somebody like Isaac Newton, one of the greatest mind ever lived, I think in 18 months, came up with 3 things that arguably should take a few hundred scientists, few decades to come up with. And this guy comes up with, and at the same time, believes in weird stuff.
Oh yeah.
You know, the competition, the partition in the human mind is amazing, where you can have one of the most empiricists that sort of ever lived, and weird stuff about the Jewish temple and alchemy, and we like really strange stuff.
And to plug the history of science, this is why the history of science is so fun, because you're presented with a certain picture of these great scientists, and you start to dig in their personal lives, and you realize that Newton wrote more about alchemy than he ever did about physics.
Way more, yeah. Only found out in an auction when it was stuff was being sold, and then suddenly, that. But still, again, he's a man. Again, when he talks about everything needs to be understood in the context. Everybody was religious. That's why when you have a lot of Christians coming to you and saying, Oh well, you owe it to Christians. All these, I think it was the guy who used to always debate Christopher Hitchens. He's an Indian dude living in America, and he always wears a jacket. What's his name again? It's D'Souza.
I believe it's Dinesh D'Souza.
Dinesh D'Souza, yes. Yeah. He's always wearing a jacket 2 sizes bigger than himself. It's almost like it's like an afterthought. It's like I gotta borrow this.
But I can't criticize anybody's fashion. I'm not.
No. I'm having a cheap dig. Life's too short. I'm gonna vent my spleen on the guy, because at first he always turns up, and he gets told the same thing every time. But it's which is a myth. I've got to start. It's a myth. Goldfish memory. Goldfish don't have 5 seconds memory. That's incorrect. But I'll still use the analogy that he would actually use it in every single debate. It gets debunked, which is basically reciting a number of scientists who were Christians when the whole world was Christian. It's like, right. and attributing Christianity to say, well, without Christianity, we could have not found all these sciences.
Well, that's the thing. To speak to that point a little bit, Nietzsche says that in medieval Europe, Christianity was the basic saturated every aspect of society, right? Whether you're talking about the ivory tower, or you're talking about the mill worker or the farmer, you can't escape it, right? So to say, for example, that, well, all the early modern scientists are Christian, atheism didn't exist yet, right? Of course they were, right?
Probably Spinoza was the atheist of the day.
Yeah. He was, and you see where that got him, right? He was ostracized and all that other. So yeah, but I hear this argument a lot, and I don't know if you want to talk about this or not. If you got something else, we can shift to this. But I hear this argument that that's used by a lot of people, that science developed in 16th century Europe because of Europe's religious background. Specifically because of Europe's Christian background. Historically, I don't think that argument carries a lot of water. Largely because, well, do you want me to get into this? Do you have something?
Oh, definitely. I mean, that's part of the conversation, because I love to hear what happens to Galileo and Bruno. Just to make a point.
Ooh, yeah. R.I.P. Bruno. So first and foremost, it depends on what you mean by science. Let's start there, right? If we're talking about, when most people think of science, the immediate assumption is typically physics. Physics, astronomy, cosmology. And when we talk about the scientific revolution, we're talking about the revolution that happened in astronomy. Later, you get the revolutions that happen in medicine and biology and botany and stuff like that. But usually people think astronomy, physics. First and foremost, other sciences like medical sciences developed in other places besides Europe, specifically in China, right? And in India, and even in
the golden era of Islam.
Yeah, Islam developed algebra, had major advancements in astronomy. So empirically, historically, that statement is false, right? South American civilizations had much more advanced medical techniques than Europeans, right? We're still learning about certain medical remedies that these civilizations from South America were using thousands of years ago. The Mayans, development of astronomy was, they predicted everything up until 2012, right?
Yeah.
That we know of, because the Spanish destroyed all of their texts. But, different story for a different day. So first and foremost, Europe in the 15th century is not the only place that science developed. Secondly, I don't get the connection. So if we look at somebody like Galileo, there's a tangential connection between what he's saying about science and his religious belief. It's not necessarily building off of it. The exception here might be Newton in his Principia, when he argues for absolute time and space. And Newton believed that absolute time and space were reflections of God. Newton had to, speaking of how weird Newton was, I love to talk about this. Newton had a very strange, not very orthodox Christian view of God.
He didn't believe in the Trinity.
He did not, right? But he also believed that time and space, he called them God's sensorium. So basically the entire universe was God's body, and that like we moved around in God again
within the ether, probably like the stomach acids of God.
so yeah, well, yeah, like you're wandering around in God's great eyeball or whatever. Yeah.
So whenever there's an earthquake, it's God rolling his eyes.
Could be, right? So yeah, sorry for that little tangent.
It's fun. It's fun. No, it's brilliant because it's all connecting. Now, so far, we're seeing elements of philosophy still, because remember, today's topic is if science actually made philosophy obsolete. But up to this point, we're talking 16th, 17th century, proper science, like there's no academic, there's no proper PhD in science. These are guys are, brainiac. They're obsessed. Usually they have an obsessive personalities, all of them. And I think to date, that still persists. People obsessed with something, they'll spend hours and hours and hours devoting themselves to something, and they go like absolutely nuts. Same, yeah. Einstein was kind of like that as well, but had extra curriculum on the side. But still, some of the, we're talking now 20th century. We're talking about pure the power of mind. It's been told that we're sitting in his patent office. Somebody's cleaning the window, and he gets an experiment of the mind of somebody's falling a free fall, and the elevator and the two trains, and it seems to be like applying a little bit of philosophy or like pure thinking to come up with models that still needs to be falsified, still have to be falsified, because as you know, in his relativity theory, he had to make a prediction, and his fame was on the line, and it had to come true.
Yeah. So let's we can maybe move our way into the 20th century. I'm sure I'll have other historical examples to draw upon, but so what you said earlier is absolutely correct, and I want to reiterate it just for the sake of the historical argument I'm trying to make here about the relationship between science and philosophy. The sciences start to split from philosophy, kind of one by one. originally, philosophy is kind of the mother of all of these academic disciplines. You go to any university you want to today, like most of these disciplines at one point in time were a branch of philosophy.
Yeah, that's why the PhD still persists.
Right, the philosophy. Yeah.
Yeah.
And what we call the natural sciences, the word scientist didn't really start to become widely used until the late 19th century. Before that, what we would call scientists were called natural philosophers. And the academic split doesn't really start until the late 19th, early 20th century. And that's largely because of changes that were happening in education, specifically the development of the public university system throughout Europe and in places like the United States. And that's the beginning of what we would call hyper specialization. So you would go to school and major in physics, and then you would be stuck studying physics for the rest of your academic career, or you would go to study psychology and you would be stuck studying psychology. That's where science and philosophy start to diverge from one another historically. Late 19th, early 20th century. Absolutely. So we could talk about Einstein. I also want to talk about something that you keep bringing up, which is this idea of falsifiability. Is that okay?
Oh yeah. We're obviously gonna go to Kuhn and Popper. Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So this is one of the areas. Now, the subject of the talk has science made philosophy obsolete. There's my direct answer. Maybe I should have started off with this, but my direct answer would be yes and no. Right?
Agreed.
Stereotypical philosopher answer there. It depends, right?
It depends what you mean by a tree.
Yes.
Go Jordan Peterson on you.
I mean, it does depend, right? And that's why I have to stick with the yes and the no. So I want to say, and remind me to come back to falsifiability. There's some other things I kind of want to get out the way first, if you don't mind.
Sure.
So I think there's some low-hanging fruit, so to speak, that I want to deal with right off the bat. And that is kind of the difference in methodology. Science, and I can come back to this, science has a particular sort of methodology. I think falsifiability is a critical component to that. Experiential falsifiability. I think science at its core has a sort of empiricism that's there, that has to be there. But philosophy doesn't necessarily have that. In some areas, yes. In other areas, no. So there are some low-hanging fruit as far as the difference between science and philosophy. And what I mean by that is that there are certain areas that I don't think science will ever be able to give us a quote-unquote answer to.
Are you referring to axiology? Do you think axiology will always be immune?
Well, I'll jump straight into it. So, and what I mean by that is that there are some questions I don't think science is interested in answering, or that as much science as we do, we're not going to come closer to an answer with. The two big examples I have, which are philosophical disciplines, are ethics and political philosophy. I think science can help us in some instances with these situations. So super quickly, for those who might not be familiar. So ethics is the study of right or wrong action. How should I live my life? What's the best way for me to live my life? We have these major ethical theories that every philosophy student has had to take a class on before: utilitarianism, deontology, virtue ethics, and this is not to say I'm not suddenly becoming a Platonist here. I don't think that ethics exist outside of nature, or that ethical truths lie beyond the natural world. I think the sorts of questions that ethics wants to ask are not the sorts of questions that science is asking or answering.
Yeah. Well, do you because I think that's going to follow from Hume's law. You can't get ought from is, and ought is ethics, because this is you're postulating something as that this is how you should be, and science is just still it as it is. This is what's happening right now. However, in the moral landscape, Sam Harris
Mhm.
is postulating that incoming knowledge through epistemology, through empirical evidence by science, it can change your moral compass. And I'll give you an example.
Mhm.
I've become a vegetarian
Yeah.
about 2.5 years ago, right? And we've known for quite some time, before the modern era, according to some Christian beliefs, and men have dominion over all animals. Animals are mostly vessels, like zombies. They don't have souls. They don't feel the pain. They're just here for us to ride, use, and eat. Modern neurology comes, and we understand now that they feel exactly the same. They feel agony. Some even have the intelligence of 5 years old, like pigs. They can even contemplate pain. They can predict it, which is worse than the killing, because I don't do it for the killing. The killing takes a second. You're gone. It's never the killing. It's the suffering. It's the dairy industry. It's the stuff that we do that makes the sentient being suffer. Now, science has told us that. Has it changed a bit of morality?
Yes. So I think I was about to talk about, I think animal rights is a perfect example. I don't think that ethicists can do ethics in a corner without talking. Like, ethics for me is inherently interdisciplinary. I think it has to be, especially some areas of ethics. So I think you're absolutely right. If we're talking about animal rights, there's got to be some biology in there. There's got to be some, uh, you know, psychology in there as well. If we're going to talk about animal consciousness, we got to factor in science into that for sure. I 100% agreed with you there. Um, what I'm thinking of, and one of the areas that I really like to combine philosophy and ethics to illustrate this point, and you brought up the ought versus is distinction. I think that's kind of where I was going with this, would be examples from the philosophy of technology and the history of technology, right? So the big one that I have to teach on a regular basis, I have to teach World War II history. You have the Manhattan Project, you have the
Mm-hmm.
construction of the atomic bomb. So, and the classic, how this is classically set up is, science can tell us about how to build the bomb, but it can't tell us about whether or not we should use it. And that's kind of what I'm speaking to. It's not to say that science can't provide us direction there, right? Scientists like Leo Szilard said, well, if we detonate this thing, this is the loss of life that we're talking about, right? And he provided those sorts of like calculations for sure, right? But I think there's an inherent difference in methodology that I think we have to be aware of. Another example of this that I often talk about with my students, because I think it's very pertinent, is the use of social media and the proliferation of technology and the ease of access to technology that people have, right? There is a ton of science that goes into the construction and the building of a smartphone, right? A lot of very dense, complicated science. Um, Again, back to that question, is this good though? Right? Is the ease of access to technology and media, especially for young people, is that a quote unquote good thing? And so when we have to talk about societal good, when we have to talk about what's good for us as a community, we're firmly within the territory of ethics.
Yeah, and even with the analogy of the atomic bomb,
Mm.
and the ontology of the bomb is equal. You can use to destroy caves and mountains and get good stuff that we can use. So it's not really used to harm anybody. That's
Mhm.
one use. But even if you use it to kill people, and this is how complex ethics and morality is. What if you, because you do, and that's probably arguably the reason why it happened, is you're trying to do that to avoid more killing that could have happened if you have not used it.
Right.
It's almost like the train analogy. You got to kill someone.
The trolley
But,
problem.
yeah. So that's what ethics is always. You got to involve so many scenarios, and nothing is ever black and white.
Mm-hmm.
Even the killer, even that serial killer, if you end up dissecting his brain and ending having a tumor over his amygdala or prefrontal lobe cortex, did he actually have a choice?
Mm-hmm. So, and I think so. Ethics is one of those areas that I think falls outside of the purview of science. Not to say that it's outside of nature, outside of the natural world. Again, I'm a naturalist. I don't think so. But it's outside of the sort of knowledge and understanding that we get via the scientific method, for example.
Yeah. And look, I agree with you. But if there's an analogy, there's a boardroom and the ethics committee sitting there. I'd bring advisors from every discipline, so I have well-informed decisions. So I'll have a psychologist, I'll have a scientist, and I'll bring you all these. And that's how modern corporations work these days, by the way, and governments. You get the independent advisors to advise on things. So that ethics will have its own way of engaging, but having these advisors coming to better inform ethics, they're not intrinsic to the process, but they're there to advise and aid and guide sometimes.
Mm-hmm. And I also want to acknowledge, especially what you said about veganism and animal rights issues. The reason that we are having those conversations is largely a result of the development of the sciences.
Yes, yeah.
So you're right about that.
Maybe our prefrontal lobe cortex as well is getting slightly bigger by the day, because it's only 2 million years old. We live. The brain is 525 million years in the making, and we lived with the ancient brain, the reptilian brain, that just sex and food and stuff. Then you get the middle brain, and then you get the groups and the ape-like, and then you have only 2 million years ago the prefrontal lobe cortex, and you get all the stuff that goes with it and the rationality and the logic. So we haven't really evolved most of the time to make sense of things. We're here just to survive. So maybe as time goes by, we're going to look upon ourselves in 300 years from now and look at humanity and say, bloody hell, would you believe we used to do this to cows and put them in prisons and milk them and inseminate them and take their calves away from them while they're screaming? And we used to do that for a little bit of milk in your coffee in the morning.
Right. For our own pleasure, right? Not even our survival. So, yeah, I think I think so. To clarify and to go back to this, I think ethics employs a different sort of methodology. There's a different sort of rationale that's at work. That doesn't necessarily overlap with science, but yes, I would agree that there are certain areas of ethics which a scientific information can be hugely valuable. So that's the one low-hanging fruit. The other low-hanging fruit, I think I would say, would be political philosophy. Right. Again, I'm going to say the same sort of thing here. Science, for sure, has a lot to say about good policy, right? Environmental policy is based 100% on environmental science.
So I've got a question for you on the politics. Was Trump an ontological douchebag or epistemological douchebag? He's a douchebag either way.
Yeah. So because I'm a teacher and some of my students
I know.
watching this,
I'm getting you in trouble, Michael.
We can talk about that off air. Yeah.
Okay.
So what's been on my mind recently about this question, because I'm currently teaching a class on Chinese philosophy, just to kind of set up a situation here. What happens in the spring and autumn period of Chinese history, we're talking about roughly 1000 BCE. You have the fall of the Zhou dynasty. China breaks up into all of these different states that are in conflict with each other. And this is the period that you see the rise of thinkers like Confucius, Sun Tzu, Lao Tzu, of the Tao Te Ching fame. And one of the central questions, and this is a way in which history informs philosophy, one of the central questions that they were struggling with was what should a state look like? And what form of government is the best form of government? And how should we properly rule a state? This is the beginning of political philosophy in China. And
was that pre-Plato?
Yeah, I think so. This was Confucius. Confucius is 6th century BCE.
Yeah.
Don't quote me on that.
So that's before the virtuous city of Plato.
Right. It's before Plato wrote his Republic. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Wow. Interesting.
Yeah. And you kind of have these, in general, you have these two general schools that emerge. You have Sun Tzu, who wrote The Art of War, who advocates for, a sort of militarism, that governments ought to be like heavy-handed, that people are inherently greedy, murderous, and that government exists to keep people in their place. Basically,
modern day dictatorship.
Yeah, well, this is another thing. Like, maybe not much has changed over the past 3,000 years. And Confucius is coming along saying, like, listen, government ought to exist. This might sound, I'm interpreting this through an American lens, so I apologize for any Confucian scholars out there, but government ought to exist for the benefit of the people. Thomas Jefferson, right?
Yeah.
So you have this dichotomy and this debate that's going on during that time period. And as you mentioned, this is still a debate that's happening today. Science can tell us about things like, what should we do about climate change? And that overlaps with politics a lot, right? It can tell us about, what it provides us with all sort of quantitative analysis about, medical policies, the whole healthcare debate. That's another big overlap between science and politics. But in these fundamental questions about the nature and structure of government, what the relationship between the people and the government ought to look like, there's not no matter how much we learn about physics, we're not going to be able to answer. That's a straw man, okay? But we're not going to be able to answer those questions.
Yeah. On the climate change, I think Christopher Hitchens was once talking, and he was talking about how our sun has got 5 billion years to go. And some guy stood up, was like really scared. He said, "Excuse me, did you say 5 million years or 5 billion years?" He said, "No, 5 billion years." He said, "Thank God." So this is how we're short-sighted we are, and that's the environmental issue, because it's not impacting us like right now,
right.
And we are so short-sighted, and we only care for what we experience right now. We would rather trade off maybe future, and because we're not going to be around, with that pleasure, with the current pleasure we are in now. But the problem is, I guess there's an ethical problem of we've come to this world, we're thrown here, we argue whether it's God or not. But the one thing you can do, and I think we all should, is leave this place a little bit better than we found it. Be nice.
I wish everybody could hear that message and heed that advice. But this is a very good example of one of the general points that I want to make. So back to the question, has science made philosophy obsolete? This is an area that I would point to and say, I said yes and no. This is one of the areas I would point to and say, no, it hasn't made philosophy obsolete, because the science about climate change is very clear, right? Scientifically, there's not a lot of disagreement going on, maybe about some particular areas, but in general, climate change is happening, and everybody agrees that it's going to have a disastrous effect, probably sooner rather than later. But in the United States, I don't know how it is in Australia. I can't speak to that.
Oh, but we're horrible. We're horrible.
In the United States, this is a very, very contentious issue. So science has done what it does. This is a fact of the world that we're living in. But it's not that science says that, and everybody's like, oh, okay, maybe we should. No, that's not what happens. So this is, I think, a place for philosophy to come in and say, let's make clear the ideas that we're talking about, maybe put forth some good arguments, some good ethical arguments about why people ought to care about climate change, why people ought to care not just for themselves, but for future generations. This would be, again, this is low-hanging fruit, but I think this is a solid example of that.
Remember, Michael, if this sequence of events happen, there will be a generation existing in a better condition because the generation before them have done the right thing by them. So eventually will catch on, and you will end up living in the one that you wanted to live in, rather than well, you still can improve on it, but you will live in one of those realities that previous generations have done the right thing by you. Therefore, you're living in a better condition, and you can see it when you've seen it on the economical, on the human rights, but the environmental stuff, because it's a little bit. Our lifespan does not allow us to see the big picture, and that's a problem. And and maybe we need some. I mean, you get all these disaster movies, and where things are going to go completely south, and maybe some like a repercussion video of what the world is going to look like will bring this home, because people don't understand the gravity of the situation. It's really, really dangerous.
It is, and this. I'm not really in an academic position to talk about it, but to me, I equate this with, people being unable to realize their own mortality, right? So this is one of the classic examples in philosophy. In psychology, I was reading something that said that, most people don't actually realize they're going to die until they're like past the age of 30, right? Which, I'm well past 30, but we don't have to talk about that. But it's hard for humans to imagine, even within our own lifetime, it's hard for us to imagine or come to accept the fact that we're going to die. And so with climate change, we're talking about not just a personal threat, we're talking about an existential threat to human beings, period. Right? But we're, like you said, we're so short-sighted that we can't conceptually grasp that.
Yeah. So Nick Bostrom, the simulation hypothesis, do you think we have done that already, and we are now a simulation of our future selves? Trying to see what the hell has happened.
So
this is philosophy, folks. We move from Aristotle to simulation.
Yeah, well, and this kind of ties in with what we were talking about with Plato, because I think some people take the idea of a simulation too seriously, if that makes sense. Right? Because if we take it too seriously and argue that we're in a simulation, you're basically arguing for a form of Platonism, in the sense that what I'm seeing and what I'm experiencing right now is not real. I think what Bostrom, again, I'm not here to make enemies, especially with Bostrom would argue me under the table. All right. So he's in a different, I'm in the junior leagues. Bostrom's playing for like the NFL, right? But I think the purpose of the simulation argument, much like the purpose of Descartes' methodological skepticism that he employs in his meditations on first philosophy, the purpose of that is for us, is kind of a thought experiment for us to realize certain things about epistemology, how we know what we know, right? And maybe our knowledge of certain things isn't as foundational as we previously thought. So to answer your question, I think it's a fun thought experiment. I can't say that it's real.
And that's why Hume is a bloody genius, because to Hume, this would still not matter, because that's going to be still our reality, and you still have to live it. Okay, let's say it's a simulation. Well, it's almost the same as if there's a God, if there's no God, there is a simulation, there is no simulation. You still have to go, oh my God, hide from the wife because you forgot to buy some food for the dog and she asked you to, and you know you're going to be in trouble, whether it's simulated or not.
I'm not going to comment on that because my wife's in the next room. So
there you go. So
Yeah.
it's you still have to live with, even if the product of the mind is as real as as it is, then it's still real. You're gonna have to live with that. So that's why the issues of ontology, and we talked about it offline. I'd rather engage with epistemology and not the epistemology that engages the truth with the capital T, because I'm very happy with provisional truth or facts that makes me a toaster, that help me medicate my sick kitten. I can watch a movie and enjoy it. I can, I'm very happy with these things. I don't need the ultimate truth. Really, I really don't.
So that's I'm really glad you brought that up, because this is something I wanted to come back to when we were talking about mathematics. So the low-hanging fruit, I would say, is political science, ethics. What I think people are asking when they ask, has science made philosophy obsolete, are areas like epistemology. And so I want to talk about this for a second. Right?
Yes.
So this is the more difficult, higher up fruit here. So I think that, and I'm going to say this, and I'm not going to like overanalyze it, and then I want to hear what you think about it. But so I would say that philosophically speaking, I'm a naturalist. So the idea that truth exists, capital T truth, right? Transcendent truth. As for a naturalist, there's nothing that transcends the universe, right? So this idea that when we talk about truth, or even if we talk about the laws of logic, or even if we talk about the laws of physics, there's a physicist named Lee Smolin that says this. The laws of logic don't transcend reality, right? And the laws of physics are describing reality. So by definition, they don't transcend reality. They're talking about this universe, and they're describing.
And sorry to disrupt the conversation here, but we know that the laws of logic have shifted a little bit with quantum. There's something called quantum logic right now. There are things where our empirical observation is demanding from us to edit and enhance.
Yes. I'm glad you interrupted. I'm glad you brought that up. So most of what I do academically is focused on a French philosopher named Gaston Bachelard. And he has this book that he writes called The Philosophy of No, which he's talking about the scientific method. He's very similar to Popper with his idea of falsification. Bachelard argues that science, quote unquote, progresses via negation, right?
Yes.
That we have these major ideas in the history of science, like Newton's theory of gravity, Darwin's theory of evolution, Einstein's theory of relativity, and that's usually how we view the history of science. But if you view the history of science under a microscope, you see all of these failed ideas and failed hypotheses.
It doesn't tell you what's true. It tells you what it's not true, and it almost narrows down the list.
Right. Well, that's what has happened. Like, we get a very skewed picture because we focus on the most successful theories. What we don't focus on are all those scientists, and RIP, pour a little bit out for them, that spent their whole lives dedicated to something that didn't work out.
Which this very same analogy will work with the fine-tuning universe, because you're talking about a sample of one, but that's the sample you're existing in, but you don't know how many failed other experiments before you come up with that fine-tuned universe.
Yeah, it's a giant bag of worms, but it's not an empirically verifiable sample, right?
Yeah, that's true. Exactly.
You only got one.
Yeah.
What I wanted to say about quantum mechanics is that Bachelard goes on to say that he would be what a lot of people would call practicing scientism in philosophy. because he makes the argument that philosophy ought to amend itself to current findings of science. And one of the most biggest examples of this, he says, is with the laws of logic, right? Historically, the laws of logic have been fixed, established. They've always been there. But he says, if you take, for example, the law of identity, first established by Aristotle, one of the three foundational principles of logic. The law of identity, that A is A, that if I say this is a pen, I mean that this is a pen. We can't be that strict about the law of identity nowadays, because we know that at a quantum level, the law of identity is not a logical truth.
It's not fixed reality.
It's not a fixed reality. It doesn't always apply to quantum particles. Sometimes, a quantum particle can be here at point A and at point B at the same time. So
that's the entanglement. But even more, actually, I think the entanglement is misunderstood. But it's rather the observer effect. It's our consciousness is manifesting. So everything in a state of superposition until we start looking at it, and it becomes the thing we're looking at. But that's why Einstein said, and he gone cuckoo on quantum mechanics in the Copenhagen interpretation. He said, "Don't tell me the moon isn't there when I'm not looking at it."
Right. So, I mean, you brandish me a practitioner of scientism or what, but I would agree with that. I mean, I think that if quantum mechanics shows us a picture of reality that is not in tune with these basic laws of logic, then we have to amend the laws of logic.
Yes.
And that is, for whatever reason, that's a very philosophically controversial statement.
Well, I don't find it that way, because I think the laws of logic help us navigate certain realities and certain issues. They're not there is a use. I like things to exist because we're using them for something. For things to exist, like an ornament, and I think there's parts of the Quran that talks about how the stars, and I think it's in the Old Testament as well, how the stars and the planets, they're just there as an ornament to decorate the sky. But when you know the reality, and you know that supernovae are the reason why planets exist, because that's the explosion. So it's like, forget about Jesus dying for your sins for you to exist. It's the stars died for you to exist, and then it gets relegated to the trivial existence of decoration rather than their importance to reality. And I find it's quite infuriating.
Yeah, and I get the say the last part of the example again. Sorry, I was searching for my computer cord.
That's all right.
I understand you.
I was talking about the ontology of the stars. So in the Quran and the Old Testament, so we're talking about stars and planets being seen as visible in the night sky. They're just ornaments. They're there to decorate the sky. But as we know, we talk about supernovae and how giant stars explode so they can create planets. And we understand what the importance of them for our own existence, and looking at the other cartoonish, distorted thing that has nothing to do with the reality, and how it relegates the importance of something so vital to our existence to only decoration. It's infuriating. It makes it's demeaning, I think.
Mm-hmm. I remember what I was going to say to that. I think epistemology has changed as a result of science, or that it should change as a result of science. And then what you just brought up, I would say that metaphysics, and a part of metaphysics being ontology, I think that ontology has to change as a result of science as well. So has science made philosophy obsolete? It's made certain types of ontology obsolete. And I think history has shown that time and time again.
Yes.
The stars being a perfect example of that.
Yeah. I would tend to agree with that. So I think if we're gonna maybe wrap this up in the next 5 minutes, Michael, it's the amount of brain fluid that you and I probably we've exhausted a bit of it, but it's not going to be the end of our conversation, because I've enjoyed myself so much, and I think I found a new friend. So I'm definitely going to invite you again. It's brilliant to be able to speak to somebody who will understand me going through all these different thoughts without, so that's so I'm glad I found you. So are we in agreement that both disciplines are still needed and there's still a place for them under the sun? Philosophy need to adjust a little bit and come to the ground to meet science halfway, and science need to be anchored and don't get too cocky and pushes away philosophy, that they end up being cold and detached from the warmth of the human affairs.
I think that's a fair categorization for sure. Yeah. And, we could talk about this another time. I've also deeply enjoyed this conversation. It's always nice to connect with somebody like this. I would go maybe a step further and say that there are some examples of philosophy actually helping science, right? Not just the connecting with the humanity part. I 100% agree with that. I think there's some philosophical implications of scientific topics like cosmology, like biology, 100%. But to maybe argue a little bit for philosophy, I think there's some other ways that philosophy can actually help science and help clarify some things for science as well.
Yeah. Well, it seems to be evolution is the name of the game. Everything has to adapt. Everything has to be a bit dynamic. Anything stagnant, whether it's biology, whether it's an idea through the gene and the meme, they all have to keep going and be dynamic and never be stagnant, because the cost of stagnance is always death and being written off from the history of thoughts or biological existence by the looks of things.
Mm-hmm.
Michael,
said.
I've enjoyed every minute of it. Folks, this is not going to be the end of the conversation. There will be a way more conversation with Michael. This one was a little bit broad. We talked about so many different things. Maybe next one we'll pick one thing and we try to stick to it, but we cannot guarantee it. So that's what philosophers do. They go on tangents.
That's right. Thanks for having me. This was an absolute pleasure.
Thank you very much, Michael. All right, folks, I will see you tomorrow in a live broadcast, and you can see the scheduled event in the channel. Oh, by the way, I've added Michael's channels in the description. Please check it out. Subscribe to it. It's got interesting stuff in there, so I would really urge you to check his channel out and subscribe.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.